Hello, welcome to Elephant in the Room. This is episode 3, and we are live. It'll be interesting because this is my first time using the camera streamer with YouTube. Unfortunately, Hangouts is no more. Bummer because I really like that one. It was even better than the personal one that I have, and I decided not to go back to my um, regular stream that I actually have on my computer because it wasn't as interactive as I would have liked. Now on here, I don't know if I can share my screen or not. I'll be playing around with this. I don't know how it's going to look. It just looks like it's just live, and that's it. So we will just be talking. Um, and I don't even know how it's going to look after I'm done um, with all of this. Let me see. What does this say? This is okay. So I got chat on here. I've got it says that's live. My battery's running low, even though I have this plugged in. Let's see. Maybe I don't have it pushed in good enough. Okay. Tech. Let me go double check. I'll be right back, guys. Sorry. I think my one extension cord has been compromised. So let's see. Yeah, that worked. 3-prong extension cord. The actual prong in the bottom came out. What else can happen? Murphy's Law, right? All right. So running into September now. We're about to come up on Labor Day tomorrow. We'll probably be going to the water park, me and my family. Um, and enjoying that. I'm back on my no sugar, which has really been helping. If you are noticing, yes, I have lost a nice amount of weight. I think, let's see, where am I at now? My heaviest was 223, so I'm down to 194, 191, depending upon what day I got on. I'm down to 191. So I'm really curious if this says that I'm going live. Let's see, is this still recording me while I'm off? I hope so. I'm about to go in here and look on YouTube because I'm really, really curious how this looks. It's very interesting to me. Excuse me. Oh, it says I am live now. Okay, so it shows me live on YouTube. But this is absolutely just a recorder. It really doesn't allow you to share. It's a little share button down here, but I wonder what that is. Let me hit it so I can share it on Twitter and things like that, on Facebook, that I'm on live. And I didn't start my feed on Facebook at all. I want to post this on. Come join me, y'all. Come join me in dialogue. I haven't been on in a while, huh, guys? It is absolutely crazy how busy it has been. I put it up on Facebook that I'm on here. You know, I have a sneaking suspicion that a lot of this censorship is serving a particular purpose because, you know, advertisers are eating this up as far as a lot of these channels that are on here as far as education and awareness, especially with Black empowerment. But I have a sneaking suspicion that some do not want that. So very interesting. And I don't have a lot of followers, so I'm considered low threat, right? So you all have been with me on my lock journey. As you can see, my locks have grown, you know, see, from when I first got them. I'm really excited about them. I love them. They're my baby. So catching up, we got a new school year started. So everyone's back in school, trying to get it in. Kids back in school, so that's important. Another thing, I sometimes dialogue with people, and many debates occur. But I had one dude come on and criticize my recording, saying, "Oh, you just recording out of your garage," and I'm like, "It's a grassroots movement. It's supposed to be that way. That's how grassroots look. It starts off small, then it grows, right? If a person is diligent enough, stick with it, believe in themselves, make the right contacts, takes off, and that's what I'm hoping to do." So I really found that interesting. I think that and this gets into my title of what's going on here. I think that um, we're not very encouraging to each other anymore. And if we have disagreements with each other, we want to attack the individual. I guess that's kind of normal. That's, hey, all's fair in war and whatever. And, we attack each other personally without thinking about what we're saying. And I thought that was pretty ignorant of this particular individual. And he was piggybacking off of a comment that I had made on the Dagger Squad's channel, just basically about the fellas kind of adding that feminine principle. I think that that's what is missing. I think the conscious community does a good job at getting the information out, presenting ideas, comparing ideas. I think it does a phenomenal job. Stinetta did his award show, which was phenomenal, which was awesome. It came out to be a success, even though there were hiccups in the road, and I was so happy for him and proud for him. They've reintroduced back onto the channel Polite, so they're trying to work things out, work out differences, which I commend the brothers on, because, when you're dealing with family, this family that we call the culture of Black, things are going to happen. It's not going to all be perfect. It's not going to all be roses. Sometimes there's going to be disagreements. Some of those disagreements are very profound. And, when people have love for each other and feelings get involved, whether brotherly love, sisterly love, family love, love for this information, feelings sometimes do get hurt, and there's a fallout. There's been many fallouts in the conscious community. You have with Tariq Nasheed and Dr. Umar Johnson, which was so unfortunate to me because they were such a powerhouse, and I could understand sometimes intellectually you just can't get along with people because it's just type A personalities. I mean, you've got in the conscious community, you've got type A personalities just all over the place. Let me see what this is. Okay, I'll push a button. I don't know what's gonna happen, y'all, when I push a button. I'm just trying to figure this thing out. This is my first time using it. That's sharing. I don't know what that is. Maybe that's my signal strength. I've got my chat. I can say something. People can chat. I mean, this is very basic, and it's a lot more basic than I would like it. So I'm gonna have to go back to my other browser, and I'm probably gonna have to either get a external drive to store the videos on, so not to take up space on my CPU on my computer, and make more room. But anyway, I'm excited to be back. I really miss talking to you all. I wish there was more dialogue, but I'm gonna be patient because I know eventually folks won't be shy and come along, because I mean, we live in an opinionated society for sure. So I know it ain't opinion, it's just, interest. And so that is what the way it is. I have to learn to format my show in a way that strikes the interest of people, and that's what I want to work on. So that's something I have to work on. That's part of my build up for learning to organize. It's a learning process, guys. That's why I format my show the way I do, because I don't want it to be a perfect thing. I want it to be a work in progress, and that progress be visual. What is that? What is that? It looks like a little baby. It's like completely white. It's flying around. I wish it would come over here so you could see it. Oh, I just caught it. What is that? I don't know what that is. You see that? That is an actual bug of some sort, because it was just flying around. You see that? What is that? Is that a tick? I don't know what ticks look like necessarily, or a flea. No, I gotta go. See you later. Biology in me, I can't help it. I'm a curious person. All right, so we're talking about family bonds, how education plays a role. So education's role in our ability to be family. And I kind of think there's a correlation there. So follow me on this. So I wrote down a couple of notes here. And I'm like, oh my gosh, it's gone left field again. Why? Why, Maya? Why? Well, I wrote down covalent versus ionic versus hydrogen bonding, right? Why did I talk about that? So let's look up some working definitions of these, because we are of elements combined together to make larger structures, okay? Just that simple. And so when you talk about covalent, this is all science stuff, bonds. What you're talking about is a molecular bond, a chemical bond that involves the sharing of electrons, right? So you have these things called valence shells that the electrons travel under, okay? Everything's like a circle. But occasionally it'll leave that circle because another atom either doesn't have enough electrons on it to fill its valence shell. And so it begins to um, share. Okay, it begins to share, and that's how you have your chemical bonding in a lot of ways. So this is on the molecular level as far as a covalent bond, and so it involves sharing of electric pairs between atoms. They're also known as bonding pairs, and it creates a stable balance of attractive and repulsive forces. So it can either, what was that? It can either, Kaylin, I see you. You're trying to scare me. I saw your foot. It gave you away. Do better. My kids are always trying to scare me. So it does. Uh, so you can either be attracted to each other or repulsed from each other based upon what is in that energy shell. Electrons are nothing but energy. Okay. And so that's just very basic. We're talking about covalent bonds. And I'll explain to you why I'm bringing these up. You have a such thing called ionic bonds. Okay. And ionic bonds, as described, is the complete transfer of valence electrons between atoms. It is typical of a chemical bond that generates two oppositely charged ions. It's ionic bonds, the metal loses electrons to become a positively charged cation, whereas the non-metal accepts those electrons to become a negatively charged cation. So we're talking about a whole different type of bond based upon electrical transfer, okay? And this is based upon losing or gaining, and it's upon non-metals and metals, okay? So that's the ionic bond. And then you have these things called hydrogen bonds, which tend to be a little bit stronger bonds. And so it says it's partially electrostatic attraction between a hydrogen, which is bond to a more electronegative atom. So to make sure I covered all my bonds, so it can be attracted to nitrogen, oxygen, fluorine. And it's all because of that electrical give off that the atoms are giving on as to why they're attracted to each other or not. All right. So that's just a loose definition. And the reason why I brought that up is to talk about the nuclear family, right? So if you listen to those bonds that I told you, could you describe some of those bonds, in our family? What kind of bonds do we have? Okay. How are we attracted to each other? What attracts us to each other? When a man and a woman get together and procreate, there's an attraction there. There's a chemical attraction there that attracts each other to one another. And due to the physicality of their interactions, they procreate, right? That's on the reproductive level. We're not talking about the relationship level, right? And so there's a design of the original African family. And I only brought up those bonds to let you know that bonding occurs at a very molecular level, and it carries on to a more macro level, larger level, where you can see from micro to macro, right? And so these bonds are happening all the time inside your body, and they're happening outside your body when we build relationships. So just to kind of give you that relationship. And I didn't look up to see if I made sure to explain every bond. I feel like I'm missing a bond. Okay. The covalent ionic. It says 4 types. Oh, the polar bonding. Okay. And so the polar bonding, let me put that in so I can describe it to you. Also, I want to describe it. I don't like using my own words with that because I might miss something and I don't want you to misunderstand the concept. And so the polar bond is a covalent bond. So it's a type of covalent bond between two atoms where the electrons form the bond are unequally distributed. So one's going to have more than the other, but they're still kind of attracted to each other and they're comfortable with that. And sometimes they're sharing, so they go back and forth between each other because that's what covalent bonds do. They share. Um, and then you have non-polar bonding. Okay, because that just made me remember. It's so funny how one word triggers the other. You have the non-polar bonding um, that deals with electronegativity difference. The more ionic the bond is, the bond that is partly ionic are called polar covalent bonds. No non-polar covalent bonds. Uh, is this between two atoms? The bond is formed when electrons are equally shared. Okay, so you got unequally shared and you got equally shared. Okay, so that's all of our bonds. I had 4 types. I went through them. All right, and so the types of bonds, they're stronger than others. These flies are just so annoying. It's because I got a puppy due. I got a new puppy. And so the new puppy is just all over the place. And I forgot what it is to have a new puppy. Work. So anyway, when we're talking about the nuclear family, that's one of the reasons why I started talking about bonding, because I said I was going to talk about the nuclear family. And that nuclear family comes from these concepts and people building upon it on a social level, because social scientists will use existing science terms that we have to help us better understand um, different concepts. And so that's something that has been used, the nuclear family. And what do they mean by the nuclear family? Where when you're dealing with nuclear energy, that energy is very powerful. And when it comes together, the volatility of it varies. Certain chemical aspects vary in volatility from others. And so when you're dealing with the family, you could kind of express that as well, as far as how volatile a family is. But nuclear kind of more talking about the bond, how bonded is that family. And so it's my belief and study that the African family is traditionally much more bonded than the African American family that we've created here. And the only reason why I say that is because we lost some information in our dealings in this country. And that loss of information, that loss of practice, the ability of practice. I believe that our ancestors, when they first came over there, knew exactly, who they were and what was going on, except that they were really young. But for the most part, they, were kidnapping families to a certain degree, but they were kidnapping, young Black men, African men, and then, moved, of course, to that woman for various reasons, obviously. The older folks were kind of like the last resource, although they, held a certain amount of value. And I use value loosely. I'm talking about value as far as profitability from the colonizing forces. Um, but the African family, in a lot of cases, was more of a matriarchy. For the most part, that was the design of the family. Even when you look at ancient Kemet and some of the writings, it has been uh, shown to us that the pathway through to the throne was through the mother's lineage, not necessarily the father's lineage. So the mother's lineage held a very important rate. Who the woman married, as far as the queen um, and the princess, uh, however they referred to it at that time, mattered the most, because it was believed that the lineage went through the women, similar to the Jewish tradition that the women hold the key as far as tracing back lineage. And even now in science, there's been a discovery that the mitochondrial DNA holds the key in lineage. Although the paternal lineage, of course, matters, but the maternal lineage gives you much more information as far as that mitochondrial DNA. And so that's the background and the basis for that. I did write down the elders and ancestors and their value to the tribe. How did they handle spiritual differences? So that's very, very important. Um, Knowledge, training, and understanding was the responsibility of the elders, and strict responsibility of the elders, that the elders um, were the key. And how I know this to be true is my oldest son's family is African, and an observation of the way that the family unit was ran is there's a lot of respect for the elders. Um, the children do not tend to put their parents in a nursing home or anything like that. They care for the elders right there in their own home. You will have 3 to 4 generations living under one roof easily. and they felt it was their responsibility, as they were taught, to take care of their elders. It's shameful to shift that responsibility over. Fast forward, the African American experience, we've lost that um, that culture, that ritual, that I'm looking for another word that I'm losing. But we've lost that way. We no longer we kind of more adhere to the Western ideology that you kind of put your parents away in these houses. And I'm sure that even in Europe over time, that wasn't the way it was at one point, but it has become a place where our elder care is in the hands of strangers and not in the hands of family. Me, so I more so agree with, and my grandmother's in a home, and I don't like it. But I don't have the authority to override that. But I would have preferred if we all worked together. And it's difficult because when you're working, it seems that one person might have more responsibility than the others. But again, in the African mind and concept, that was not a burden. It was a given. It was just the way it was, almost like breathing air. There's no question about it. Who's going to take care of mommy, as they would refer to her, Oma or mommy dear? It would be um, it would be the children. And it was a disgrace for it to be any other way. And unfortunately, our culture does not, because of our two family household dynamic, the woman is not home while the man is working. Although that's debatable too, because you see some African traditions where, yes, the men were the hunters, the gatherers, the fishermen, and the women were in the marketplace selling the goods, and they were responsible for a good turnout. So they were responsible in negotiating that sale while the man went and got the product. The woman negotiated the sale of the product in the marketplace, and she was responsible for getting a good deal in trade on those items. So there's so many dynamics, and we say this all the time. You may hear people say this, that the African unit historically is not a monolithic group, and you see that here in the African American community, depending upon experience, whether a person has had more of a multicultural experience or a monolithic experience as far as being around African Americans mostly in their life, or other culture groups. Depends upon how that person's perception is of the world around them. And so all these things play a role in our existence. What does that say? Okay. So all those play a significant role in our existence and how we interpret the world around us. Is always based upon our experiences and the transference of culture. And a lot of times in the African American community, we have been willing to absorb many other cultures within our group because we might think it's a good idea. We might think it's, a beautiful thing. Oh, that's wonderful. I like that. I'm going to implement that into my life, my household. And that happens in exposure of cultures. But how that breaks down in our community is how does that affect how these things look to us? How does that equate and internalize to how we deal with each other? And unfortunately, in this country, as the African American experience is known to be, is that there are a lot of unfortunate negative energies that were expressed upon us upon our arrival here: broken bonds, broken culture, broken language. And so we are in a foreigner's land, speaking a foreigner's tongue, practicing foreigners' ways, whether we want to believe it or not. We say, oh, my family's always been doing this. Well, if you trace it back to um, some of our history, even if you believe, because you do have a new movement now, an indigenous movement, Aboriginal movement that says, hey, we were always here. We are the Native Americans that many are claiming. So that is an argument. I respect that argument. I understand where people are trying to come from and the angle that they're coming from. I get it. But when you start talking about the natives and their lineage, you begin to trace them back into Mexico, South America, through the north, through Canada, the Bering Strait that was taken to cross from the Asian continent over to us. And so you have to begin to say, did they sprout up out of these places, Mexico, Asia, or did they do some further traveling from the original motherland, Africa? And some people are unwilling to draw that concept. They're unwilling to look at it in that paradigm. Um, and so, you know, it's just very important to understand the arguments I think that's going on. And it's frustrating for many of those who are Pan-Africanists and those who are trying to fight for the information of um, our true history and of our contribution to this earth that has been whitewashed and watered down. And there are those who have discovered information and fought really hard to get the information out. And now there are some new arguments being made for it, which in a lot of ways can be considered dicey. So it further separates that family bond dynamic as far as the culture of Black. And so I have concerns, and I know others have concerns about that because it's almost to the point where it's like, okay, guys, as soon as we almost get some unity, get some form of solidification, then we have another group that comes in and say, wait, no, we're not part of you. We're not you. And you look at them and you say, gosh, you really do look a lot like us. You know, you really remind me of a family member. They're like, no, 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 I got Indian in my blood. Indian is a made up name by the colonizers, by the way. So people are using Aborigine, which that word has been broken down next to original, right? That's what ab means, next to, almost like, similar to. So when I look at all these things happening around me, it's almost like I feel like a helpless child, not a childlike person, but in analogous to when the children are involved in a household where the mother and father are arguing and they're caught in the middle. You know, I'm listening to our scholar groups arguing with the scholar groups or so-called scholar groups, which unfortunately have not proven to be very scholarly so far that I've been watching. I'm just not convinced of the argument. So I am more so on the out of Africa theory. I'm closer to that. I understand the argument that the indigenous, I get it. I really, you all may listen to this and say, oh God, here we have another one. No, I get what the positioning and the posturing. I totally get where you all are coming from, especially with the dolls roles and things like that. So there's some arguments to be made. I guess it's just the way family has to be. You know, we have to argue. The human family is arguing with each other. So that's the even more vast part of it. The more macro part of it is that there's this human family dynamic that we're not acknowledging. And our culture groups have diluted that human family dynamic. So much so that we are actually fighting each other, even though we got 2 eyes, 2 ears, a nose, a mouth. Our molecular makeup is so similar that if you flip this inside out, you really wouldn't know the difference. Looking on that anatomical level, but culturally, there has been some distinct differences. And so the fight continues. Our family is being broken down even further, and we're separating ourselves even further. And it's difficult. So the next thing I wrote down is how did they handle their spiritual differences? Well, there's many schools of thought. One of the schools of thought is that there was respect for different tribal differences and practices, that there was a mindset that no one practice was better than the other, that it was accepting that if you were from this tribe, this is what you practice, and so be it. If you're from this tribe, this is what you practice. Now, I don't know if I truly understand the dynamic, and one question that comes up in my mind is, what if one tribe member marries another, which happened? You had intertribal marrying. Who is the dominant tribe? One would assume that usually in a society that does hold the male high, which has been the African experience, even though it's a matriarchal society, the male still was considered the stronghold. And so if you married into a family, then the woman would take on the customs of the male. But I suppose you do have that in reverse too. I'm sure someone could show me a case study where it comes in reverse. Okay. But the understanding that I have thus far with the information that I've been able to research is that these families, especially when you listen to Professor uh, Professor Kaba, Hiawatha Kamene, um, he usually gives out information that it was very fluid, that it was not as um, cut and dry as the Western mind experience to say and or nan, right? Either you do it my way or the highway. It was not that kind of thought process. That just was not how African people of old and even of ancient times necessarily got along with each other. But one has to question, only just a question of the mind, not necessarily contradiction. Just an educated question would be, if there was this cohesiveness, how did we fall? And so we get into that. If you study the history, we get into the divisiveness of the foreigners that we allowed into our land, who were building cultures in their own areas, and they eventually migrated into our regions and either infiltrated, conquered, and or assimilated. So you have a variation of reasons why we've discovered in research and learning tools why we fail, why we were no longer the stronghold of our own nations. And even to this day, I'm so upset that I don't have the sharing ability right now, but I was watching a Ugandan conflict. And the storyline was that the sitting president and parliament, which I just found it just really, I guess, bothered me that I saw this parliament which, I understand the parliament ideal came from a European mindset and style of government. But you see these African dignitaries sitting in parliament and they've got these blonde wigs on. And it's just the most bizarre thing to me to see that, because I thought to myself, that's not your custom. But you've adopted this government style that you're still carrying on to this day based upon your colonization. Why didn't you throw that out? And so you see, I look at this as the continued assimilation of the African mind into a European Western mind that, in my view, sought to destroy who you were, what you stood for, and for you to um, take on that psychology, take on that that way, and not rewrite like how the Haitians rewrote their own constitution. I can agree with that more. Even if you kind of borrow, at least you rewrote it yourself. And I would have to look further into the Ugandan history and government to make that further final determination. Maybe it's possible that they did borrow and rewrite, but I have a seeping feeling that they just left it in place because they're still wearing these blonde wigs when residing in their government. And I just thought to myself, that is so bizarre to me. I would, I just personally, if someone invaded my home, I wouldn't want nothing to do with what they brought to me, because what they brought to me, I already automatically know was used as a tool to get rid of me, if I can help it. And so, like right now, we as African Americans, we've never um, taken back anything because it wasn't necessarily considered ours, and we haven't overthrown anything to say, hey, we're going to recreate this and remake the wheel, as they say. But it's astonishing to me that a group of people would be conquered and still hold fast to the customs. And I guess it's not that bizarre because that's what we do here in the African American community, not knocking anybody who wears weave because I've worn it before, but even just that idea of us wearing weave and not our own natural hair is due to a forcefulness upon us to believe that our own hair was not good enough, that our own style and dress was not good enough. So we assimilated to try to fit into the dominant group. And so a lot of the habits that we have are based upon that conquering, being a conquered people. It's not an easy thing to say or to talk about, but it's the truth. We were conquered, and the evidence is in the style of dress, the clothes that we wear, and the language that we speak, and the cultural practice that practices that we have cultivated and identified with. And so I think, um, based upon what I've been reading and learning about, is that spiritual differences were not so different in that there was a certain level of respect that said, I understand that your tribe is different from mine. If I choose to assimilate with your tribe, it's because we have a common goal. And we need to bond together either to become a stronger tribe. But there was infighting, right? In Africa, there was infighting. There were warring tribes for different various reasons. And so I'm not going to sit here and pretend like we didn't have our problems. And I think that some of our problems, as far as the warring, played right into the African slave trade, played right into the separation that you see on the continent now, and seem to not be able to get right, somehow, some way, you know, um, we have not been able to subdue this European power over us. Uh, and it's happening on the continent, it's happening in the Americas as well. Um, it's a curious thing because they are not the majority. The Westerners are not the majority on this earth. But they have figured out a way to war and conquer in such a way as either put fears into the hearts of those who were in rule that to where um, they gave in to that particular power in fear of their own lives, I suppose, or fear of being taken over, or maybe a family member having something happen to them. So there's lots of reasons why people concede victory, and all this plays a role. So our family values have been tampered with because of this. So one person, a few people here, and I didn't write down. I have to write her down. That I really identify with that talks about this dynamic in psychology and sociology models. Our Dr. Amos Wilson. I can listen to Dr. Amos Wilson for days. I mean, that man really put it together as far as the psychology of the mind of a people and what we're doing in current time to cause some of the disparities that we have in our family. Dr. Umar Johnson does a good job of breaking down the psychology of the child mind and how the current system is seeking to break that mindset down and corral it into a system that is not beneficial to the progress of African peoples in this country. Dr. Joy DeGruy, her work is on the post-traumatic slave syndrome and speaks largely to the psychology and social aspect of the African experience here in America and how historically on that level, how that trauma that we've experienced plays a dynamic role in how we perceive ourselves and our family and our extended family around us, which we don't look each other's family. I had an incident because I love going to the Ethiopian restaurant. I go as often as I can when I'm in that area. And one thing I noticed, I sat and watched a group of Ethiopians here in the restaurant. The women were trying on some garments. It looks like possibly work garments that they were going to start wearing at work because I noticed they wear a particular uniform when they're working. It's very lovely. And the dress, I don't like calling it costume because it sounds like it's not a part of. A costume sounds like something else that doesn't even belong to the people, that they're just putting something on to disguise. And so I don't like using the word costume. I like to use the word, their garments. So the garments that they were wearing was a very beautiful garment. The women were trying on, and they were speaking to each other in their language. And, they were just so loving to each other. The way that they were talking to each other, they're kind of more of a soft-spoken people. They don't speak forcefully. Some languages you hear are very forceful, and it sounds like they're yelling. They're not. It's just a little bit more forceful. But their tone of voice was very gentle and very soft and very loving. They were just so loving to each other. And I thought, I wish my people could be like that more often. Not that we're not ever, but just more often. And of course, this was a tight knit group. They're working together. So, that's that dynamic. I don't want to play it all off like Ethiopians are inherently more kinder than African Americans. I'm just saying what I observe as far as the behaviors. Someone coming in, they knew they hugged each other. They had the shoulder to shoulder hug that they did. They didn't really frontal hug, they shoulder to shoulder. So opposite shoulder to opposite shoulder when they hugged each other. And it was just a very, it was loving. That's what I felt. I didn't know these people from Adam. I didn't know what they were saying. I couldn't understand the language, but the um, the energy that I received off of them was very loving. Um, so we got Dr. Joy DeGruy work, DEGRUY. Professor James Smalls has been in the game so long. A lot of people have been in the game so long. Dr. Francis Cresswell-Sing is another good one. And so they talk more on the psychology of the African mind. They're very interested in the mind concepts to me. Of course, Dr. Uh, Yusuf bin Yohannakin is another good one. But he speaks more on the historical aspect. And of course, he teases that we've lost our African minds, but just like Dr. John Henry Clark. And so, these people have spent a lot of time in the work, taking time out. Their careers may have suffered in one way or another because they're not assimilating to the social norms of the uh, education that they've learned and applying it in the traditional way that their education expected that they would. They used the information and went outside of that paradigm and said, you know what, I'm going to apply this to work for the benefit of African peoples uh, in America and in the diaspora. And I think that's important, because we don't realize the sacrifice people make when they do this work. We think it's all fun and games, and um, it's all about glam. And Brother Polite and Tariq Nasheed talked about this on Sinetta Station. I don't know if he has he has a suspension of it, but if you're a Patreon subscriber and you get that video, but they talk about that dynamic about the non-glory side of it, the death threats, uh, the cancellation of things. Tariq Nasheed on the news dealt with a swatting, which he said he don't like to call it swatting. He likes to call it assassination um, attempt, which I agree with him. I understand why he's saying that. He broke that down as far as what swatting meant under the law and what assassination means under the law. So I can understand why he says that. And he's right. There was an assassination attempt because other people who were swatted, um, who made the news, died. They got killed based upon those efforts. And so some dudes that he banged with on Twitter, because he's constantly banging on Twitter. He's constantly posting, things about what I perceive as the right fragility going on that's described by Dr. Cresswell-Sing. She described, if you follow these works, it's almost like, listening to people give prophecy. And I'm not, no spooky person like that, but give prophecy on what is going on. Some of these people were in the 70s talking about this stuff when it was extremely unpopular. And when they were doing this work and uncovering and applying these models and intellectualizing this information, for those who could understand it and build upon it, it was not popular. In fact, Dr. Cresswell-Sing tells a story about um, how her career was damaged, because of her thesis that she submitted um, on, oh gosh, I should know her thesis because I watch it over and over and over again. Her thesis was somewhat on white fragility, but there's another terminology that she coined because she wrote it in the ISIS paper, which that's another book I have and I haven't had a chance to read. And I'm sure if I read it, I'll be able to remember. Let me just pull up her theories because I can't just toggle back and forth. She has theories because it's her father's name, grandfather's name. She built upon her grandfather's work, which her grandfather was even doing this work, the melanin theory. the theory of color confrontation. Um, and so those are a couple of them. And so there's a lot of things that she coined, and many people are still deciphering and expanding upon her work that she has done to explain this dynamic that we're dealing with. Because for a long time, we're just kind of running around like zombies fighting for our civil rights, but we really couldn't understand the psychology behind, what is happening. And it's obvious even with looking at the discontinuance of, Google Hangouts, that those that do not want us to bond, there are people out here that are in a power structure that do not want African people to bond. In fact, there's been discovered in the early 60s, if I'm not mistaken, an FBI directive that talks about um, not allowing African people on the continent and African Americans to begin to bond and mix with each other and share ideas and build political powers together, because it would more than likely mean the end of Western powers as we see it today. The Western powers dynamic would change. And if we know anything about European history, we know that, and the European dynamic of Western powers, would include Russia, would include um, Germany, would include Europe, would include all these places that, which Europe is not truly a continent, would include, Great Britain, Italy, France. Just get a map out and look at those areas, all of those areas that are part of the EU, the European Union, that's having some trouble and wanting to break apart. So there's just such a power dynamic that is in play, that has always been there, that has always tried to affect the dynamic of the African family, because again, the family is the key. And so if you research tactics of slavery, tactics of breaking a slave, one of the breaking mechanisms was to separate the family. Because, if a family had a child and that child would get shipped off to another plantation across the country or the 13 colonies, then they don't know where that kid is. We don't have the same systems in place that they had then. Their systems were based upon word of mouth, if that, transaction was on paper, because remember, you paid taxes on your slaves. And so can you imagine? People do all kinds of things now to avoid paying taxes. Can you imagine what they did to avoid paying taxes on slaves? There's probably a lot of undocumented workers, as we like to refer them now, that plantation owners purchased under the table, but we're not willing to look at that dynamic. We just think everything was on paper. Everything's not on paper. Some things went undocumented purposely for the purposes of evading paying taxes. you know um, that's human nature. We try to avoid paying as much taxes as we can now, based upon our write-offs. A lot of us are doing it illegally, but some, especially wealthy people, do it illegally. I mean, look at the political landscape now. You got the administration of this presidency is just falling like like flies, because they're finding corruption left and right, corruption everywhere, just corruption everywhere you look. There's corruption, and so um, if you apply the things that you see now and apply them to history, but in a different kind of way, the same things you see human beings doing now, human beings were doing then, because history repeats itself, right? But it just changes based upon availability of technology, based upon, the changes in availability of systems. But it's really relatively the same concept, and that is to divide and conquer. And so we have to understand that dynamic before we can move on. So those are some people that you can look at. I've mentioned them before, but if you get a chance to watch their videos, it's so important. So I wrote down subtle divisions versus obvious divisions. The subtleties could be more dangerous due to the easier acceptance. What do our children see by their actions directly impacted by our behavior as adults? And so, how does that break down? So, if our children, for example, are in the vehicle when we get pulled over by law enforcement, I know my children perceive everything about me. They're very concerned with me, with who I am as an individual. If I'm upset, they want to know why, or they might be upset too. If I'm not doing well, they may not be fooled themselves, because I'm mom. Okay. And so say get pulled over by a police officer and that interaction is not going as normal. It's not a normal traffic stop. The officer's not going by normal protocols. They're being a divisive officer. Some of those bad apples, as America like to call it, it's not bad apples, it's a culture, in my opinion. But say that interaction is not going as a typical traffic interaction. They're going to understand the stress levels. They're going to understand it the way that officer is speaking to me. They're going to perceive and understand the difference between a friendly conversation and a stressful interaction. All these things play a role. And they're going to also note the way that I respond to that officer. So if the officer is putting me in a position where, I'm feeling antagonized or I'm feeling nervous or I'm wondering what is that officer's motive, they're going to perceive all of that. And those are the subtleties. And so, what they take from those conversations and interactions is how to behave with law enforcement. Mom seemed kind of afraid, or she seemed very irritated or agitated. Is this how I'm supposed to interact with officers? And why am I supposed to interact? I thought they were supposed to be here to save us because television tells us that they're here to save us. Or, when I go to my school auditorium, uh, it's not conference. Why am I losing words? When we're in the auditorium of school and we're having a function there that's giving us information, what is being conveyed? Of course, the norm is trust your firemen, trust your police officer. They're there to help you. Doctors, um, uh, even your local officials, politicians. They're all given that blanket perception of trust. But then when they learn a different history as they experience things in their life that maybe that wasn't exactly true. Why did the school tell me that these are people that I can trust? But I'm looking at mom interacting with this police officer in a very interesting way. How do they internalize that? What does that mean to them? How do they see that? What do they take from that interaction? What is the lesson? Does the parent explain it to them when they finish that interaction, or are they so shooken up that they don't even bother? They're just happy to get out of the situation. Don't talk to the kid about that. All those play a role in how our children perceive the world around them. It's very important to understand that our interactions and experiences become somewhat or mostly our children's interactions and experiences. And so, what do they take from that? What's the lesson? What is the outcome? Um, how does it play a role in their development? These are all important things to understand and realize when when you have a child. It's a beautiful moment, but then you get to a point where you realize, oh wow, oh yeah, they're in a society. Especially when you have black males, you realize, oh yeah, gotta have the talk that they published that a lot of white Americans were disgruntled about. How dare them talk about the talk? Oh, did you forget about our racist history? White culture America? That's another thing I've been using that I've found is interesting that you all might want to know is that in diffusing some of these people when I'm having a debate with them or having dialogue with them is when I use the word instead of white people, I use the word white culture. It speaks differently to them, and their arguments change. When you say white people, they behave a certain way. But when you say white culture, they understand different. And this is a small discovery, in my opinion, that I've noticed. I've noticed it. I felt it. It's visceral. I see the difference. And so if you all run across a video, try it. Just see if when you're talking to someone, you use the term white culture, what kind of feedback you get from that. Even though it's gloomy and not sunny out here, it is still humid in Texas. I had to try to fix my garage because one of the hinges came off. And so I put that hinge back on because I wanted to be able to let up my garage. And I really didn't feel like being inside. It's still nice and warm. Still want to be outside. I like being outside. I told y'all that before. I like being in the elements. Okay. And so our children interpret our behavior. And because individuals are different in their internalization of things and how they perceive things, um, each child will take from that conversation maybe something different, or from that interaction something different. And if the parent is not explaining it to them, and how the parent is explaining it to them matters. I'm not saying one way is right or the other. I'm saying that the conversation or lack thereof makes a difference. And if conversation, the type of conversation I have, make a difference. Okay, all those play a role. So I also wrote down early education in America, who was for it and against it, to the general public. A lot of people don't understand or know this, but there was an actual battle on education that had nothing to do with Black people. Okay, the initial discussion on education had to do with who would receive it in the white society, because that's who was considered legal citizens. And it seems in history that women were allowed to learn, but just different things. They weren't allowed to learn certain uh, disciplines. So you have a history disparity between men and women. There's also disparity between who white males perceived as foreigners in this country. And so, the misogyny laws came out on, who could marry each other, who had the right to property, how to get that property ownership, how to make claims on it. If people passed away in your family, um, how they, were able to obtain land that was inherited. And so when you had a situation where, white males were having sexual relationships with African women, um, or what we call Native women, who in some cases were African women just transferred into that Native concept because they were not part of that migration that came over from the continent. Some of them were here and some of them were made to be slaves that were here, because remember, when the 13 colonies were established, and you had these um, perceived benevolent pilgrims, as the story tried to make them out to be, who were actually murderous people. When they got off that boat, the Mayflower, right? That's the most famous one, but that wasn't the only one. When they got off that Mayflower, they were not friendly. They were not welcoming. A lot of natives died because of their arrival, because there were many diseases that the Europeans carried in their body that the um, indigenous people here were not accustomed to. And so there's a complete dynamic um, going on there. Hey, Kaylin, did you feed Angel today? Put some. Okay, did you feed Angel today? Okay. All right. And so um, you have a complete dynamic here of individuals who arrived to a foreign land to them and who made assertions that were not in favor of the people here. Okay. And the people here, in their unwillingness to understand who these people were that they were dealing with, showed them medicine, showed them how to live, how to survive, because they were dying. So, yet we have another story of the Western experience arriving somewhere on the brink of death, and the people in that area saving them. That's not the first time that has been a story to where they would have been annihilated. These people were constantly being saved if you look at the history of it. So early education in America was for white males. It was not for anybody else. And they began to trickle down what they felt they wanted others to have. So, and they were considered the founding fathers of the nation of America, but there's some more deepness that involves the Moorish community in that story, if you care to research it, because the Moors have claims to this land based upon laws that were changed around them, based upon uh, the British person, the European person, not honoring their agreements. Surprise! What? Europeans not honoring their agreements? White culture. White culture teaches us a lot about their belief systems and how they operate. And all you have to do is look at their history, look at their agreements, and look how they proceeded in solidifying those agreements and how they um, honored those agreements or lack thereof. You'll mostly find stories of where they did not necessarily honor those agreements. And so that played a role in early education. And so remember, it was illegal for slaves to be educated. And if you were a free Black, that was even questioned because free Blacks even had a hard time realizing their rights. They had to go to court a lot to realize their rights. And in many cases were denied, stripped. If you ever see that movie, 17 Years a Slave, based upon a actual person's life, bestseller book. Let's say 17 years, 12 years a slave. I'm sorry, 12 years a slave. I said 17, I apologize. 12 years a slave. That was a real person's life that happened to someone. And it's telling you the story of often how um, free Black men were stripped of their freedom, their worth, their wealth, because some white person said that they weren't supposed to have it. And so that's again speaking back to what now would be perceived as the American, the white male's inability to honor agreement. And we still see that going on today, the culture of white people having a hard time honoring agreements, but they will be sticklers of laws when it comes to you, the outside person, who they perceive as the outside person. You don't stick to agreement, they're gonna invoke the law. But when they don't honor agreements, they don't necessarily invoke the law. And that's just true. That's just the truth, whether you like it or not. That is the culture of white. So when I speak of white, I'm talking about a culture. I am personally talking about a culture. I'm talking about a culture that created laws, that created a mindset. Remember, we talked about de jure law versus de facto law and the difference between the two. So all these play a role. Okay. Um, so I wrote down Dr. Amos Wilson argues African-centered education because the European training does not focus on balance, but on indoctrination. So how do we know this to be true? Well, just look at the textbooks that have been written over time. Initially, our textbooks, when it talked about our history, basically said that the Europeans saved us from Africa and therefore we ought to be grateful. Okay, in brief, summarizing. Fast forward to today, there's touching on our history as far as the slave trade. There is more transparency when it comes to that. There is more admissions when it comes to that, but it is still a partial story. It is not the full story. I don't expect them to tell the full story of everything to elementary students and even middle school students, but once you get in high school, there needs to be acceptable amounts of information available to teenagers to be able to research better their own history. And there's still a debate on who the ancient Egyptians were, the Kemites, and their role. You have European Arabs that will say, "Oh no, those were us. That was us. They're not African. They're not Black." As far as Egypt, they were us. But you have scholars who have come out with the carvings in the pyramids that show this one famous one where you can see the difference between. Let me see if I can quote this off. It was up here. The famous one where it talks about or it shows the different groups, and it's unfortunate I can't show this to you. Let's see if I can find what they named these people as far as just deciphering information on tombs and on the walls of the dwellings of these people. So there's a contention, National Geographic magazine and Robert Draper contention is that Blacks invade conquered Kemet in the 8th century BC and crowned themselves pharaoh. So the Europeans believe that they were first there. They were the dynasty, and that we didn't come into play until the 8th century, which they focus on us being the 25th dynasty. But the on the other end, um, let me just kind of read this in brief to you all because this will be towards the end of the show. And so I think we're only an hour in, so I think we can go through this. And this is from a site called Kemet.com, Kemet Digest Monthly, Critical Insights in the Brief, published by 2008, Haruka Anu and Tanefer Ankh. This was published April 2008, so they haven't been publishing anything from that time. But they're basically saying in February 2008, publisher of the National Geographic magazine featured on its cover a contemporary painting depicting a fictitious battle between Nubia and Kemet. Okay, so they're saying it was a forgery. And feature an essay, so Kemet and Egypt are the same thing, and feature an essay by a Robert Draper entitled The Black Pharaohs, alleging Black Pharaohs of the 25th dynasty invaded a non-Black but white Kemet. Here again, African people are confronted with the racial pathology exhibited by another bastion of white racism and the myth of white supremacy. In spite of the overabundance of facts and documentation that proves beyond any doubt that the Kemetians, like their Nubian relatives, were Black, the pathology of white racists apparently would not allow them to accept reality. So instead, they persist at propounding a contrived myth of white created ancient civilizations as though it were history. This contrivance reappears frequently as if were a person suffering with hiccups. Nevertheless, we find it important to address these episodes of psychopathic hiccups as they occur. So they go on to say National Geographic magazine and Robert Draper's essential contention is that Blacks invaded and conquered Kemet in 8th century BC and crowned themselves pharaoh. Draper says Pi was P-Y-E, P-I-Y-E, Pi or Pi was, okay, thank you. I have no viruses. Yay. Okay. Pi or Pi was the first of the so-called Black Pharaohs, a series of Nubian kings who ruled over all of Egypt for 3/4 of a century as that country's 25th dynasty, further inferring that the Kemetians were white or at least non-Black, he states. The ancient world was devoid of racism. That's what he says. At the time of Pi's historic conquest, the fact that his skin was dark was irrelevant. Artwork from ancient Egypt, Greece, and Rome shows a clear awareness of racial features and skin tone, but there's little evidence that darker skin was seen as sign of inferiority. So those are Draper's words. Draper's article, True to Form, uses inference and subterfuge to suggest it is an accepted fact that Kemetians were white. Of course, he produces no artifacts or images from the time period he speaks of that gives even the remotest support. In addressing these issues, our comments will focus on the race of Kemetians, the perception of race in the ancient world, and on the racist pathology of National Geographic magazine and its surrogates. Our rebuttal starts outside of Africa and Greece. Why, you might ask? Because it is to Greece that the white world of academia suggests is their beginnings of civilization, and it is Greece that informs us about the ancient white view of the Kemetic race. Scholars date the infant beginnings of Greek civilization to the 9th or 8th century BC, depending upon how you view the writings of Homer, the Iliad, and the Odyssey, which I have to stop and say that there is much information about the Odyssey, the Iliad. Is stated that Homer used hyperbole for the most part when describing things. And so I'll go on. Works that are considered to indicate the beginnings of Greek thought and identity in the ancient world. I reference this period because prior to this period, there was no alleged Greek civilization to speak of, and therefore no ancient white European or Mediterranean civilization to speak of. So you have to remember, when you're using the word European, you have to understand that that term wasn't coined until named after African goddess Europa, which was perceived in Greek. Because remember, the Greeks got their education from Ethiopia, if I'm not mistaken, in the most part. Okay, so the ancient Greeks owe all that they know for the most part to African civilization. That's where it was revered. You know, it was like one of those things. Like, you know, I lived in the Hamptons. So, you know, the Greeks was like, I studied in Ethiopia. You know, that was a sense of pride to have been educated on the continent, because that's where all the information was coming from. And so this is something that they often bragged about. Um, and so ancient white European and Mediterranean civilization speakers, so there wasn't any prior to that that has been noted or found thus far. Also, it is in this light when we point out that the Cometians were Black and certainly not white Europeans. In spite of the claims of early beginnings, it was not until the 5th century BC that the Greek state is fully established. Ooh, this chair is not fun. It's making me stick to it since it's hot out here. I have to do that. All right. Put the cloth down here. Okay. In spite of the claims of earlier beginnings, it was not until the 5th century BC that the Greek state is fully established. Prior to said time, there were a conglomerate of cities and towns of sworn allegiance to one fraternity or another. During the 4th century, Greeks and those from their conquered territories began to matriculate in Kemet in search of a better lot in life. All of them who visit noted the race and similarities of both the Cometians and the Nubians. The only distinctions drawn were in complexion, dress, and dialect. Without recounting each visitor's comments, suffice it to consult the books of Dr. William Leo Hansberry, Africa and Africans, as seen by classical writers, and the books of Dr. Martin Bernal, Black Athena, as seen by classical writers. And so, as pointed out of their works, not one of the ancient writers mentions seeing a white Cometian. We continue on to Mesopotamia, the so-called Middle East, to discern if there were whites there who could have been part of the Kemetic civilization. However, we discovered that Black civilization there were recently overrun by whites, known as the Martu, now called by modern scholars after the god Assur, Asar, Aser, Assyrians. These whites of barbaric origins, and that means without civilization, managed to conquer the Black civilizations called by modern, after more than 1,000 years of invasion and warfare. So it took quite a while to overthrow, and subsequently invaded Kemet for the first time in 725 BC. So this is them correcting when the first white people were perceived to be in Kemet. We point this out because prior to their defeat of the Sumerians and Elamites in southern Mesopotamia, there were no white powers of consequence in the area. So they were scattered civilization, but they were not a power structure, according to the information that's available. There were no signs of white civilization anywhere on the planet, much less in or near Kemet. So, in other words, what they're trying to say is these people were scattered. They were not organized. They were living a more barbaric life, meaning they were like nomadic. They were traveling around trying to find where to live, where to make, where to find good food. Ooh, the good food over here. Let's go over here. Okay, so you heard it's over here. It's over here. That they were nomadic. That's the life that they lived. But they were barbarous because the working theory is that because of scarce resources, they did have to resort to certain kind of behaviors to survive, including cannibalism, including warfare, including raping and pillaging. That was the lifestyle, hence the word barbarian. Okay, when you think of a barbarian, that's an interesting term and how we've glorified that. Conan the Barbarian, this glorious, sexy dude with the pectorals, long flowing, clean hair, and white teeth. No, no, that's a no. Okay, so we must understand this talking point to understand those who are contesting the National Geographic. If you go into any forum that says Kemetic science or Black civilization or anything, Nubian civilization, you will have white culture coming in and trying to dispel by attaching this National Geographic article that already has been debunked by those on both sides of the aisle. Okay. And that's the reality. But those that are desperate to have this history for themselves because white culture wants to say they built the pyramids, there's no way these Blacks could have built the pyramids, right? That's the going the ongoing dialogue. There's no way they could have built these pyramids because they're just not civilized people. They're them. They're the barbarians. See, they're the barbarians. So that's what we're dealing with. That is what we're dealing with. But we know, and unfortunately, white culture has lied before about other races and their contribution to this earth. Okay, so on this www.kemetway.com, if you go onto their page, it goes on further /digest /content / Nubia.html. Sorry, I can't show you the URL or pull a page up, but it's showing that infamous picture in which the Kemetic people drew themselves and how they perceived the other people, okay, who came along. And so it's very interesting to look at that. One of them has 4 distinct people and the other one has 5 distinct people. And looking at this, I have to read the caption. Okay. Sorry, regarding race in the ancient world, it's significant that in spite of having other names for their homeland, each major Black civilization also reference themselves by skin, race, color. Kemet, land of blacks, that's what it means. North Africa, Sajiga, the black-headed people, Sumer, and Meluha, land of the blacks, Indus Dravadian. Of course, one is compelled to ask the question, why would people find it necessary to designate themselves as Black in relationship to the other? Now, here's my theory. I'm going to stop it here. I think the thing that we're dealing with as far as race and race pride, as far as those who would have invaded Kemet and those who would have been outside of Kemet, I think that there had to be some kind of thing going on eventually where there was this distinction of color and there was this distinction of the races by culture group, by tribe group, though. It would have been kind of a different concept. But I think the reason why they would have named themselves that, because there must have been some kind of contention at that time as far as who truly was the proper heir to those areas, even though that civilization has been there. But sometimes civilizations that have a conquering spirit and they want to come put their flag down, they'll claim, just like in America, they'll claim this is our land. This has always been our land. I'm a red-blooded American without any acknowledgement to the history of how they got it. And you see that that psychology going on even now to this day in white culture, that they refuse to acknowledge. There's a refusal. Yeah, the natives were here, they've got their land, they've got, their tribal lands. It's only a smidgen of a piece of land in reference to their ability to freely roam across the entire. You have to think about when the so-called native people were here, they were traveling pretty much freely throughout the territories, with the exception of territories that were perceived to be managed by a neighboring tribe. And that was the rule of the land, is that, hey, we were here, it's our area, and the natives would have tribal wars too. But they, for the most part, as it's documented, recorded, and observed, they respected the boundaries, the territory. We don't go across that thicket, across that lake, across that plain, because we know that is, the Iroquois, or, the Pacta, I think it is. I don't know all the native tribes. I haven't had a chance to study them in detail. Cherokee Nation is a more recently developed nation over time, after white culture, the Pilgrims, colonists came in. But there are some tribes that were established later, amalgamated and mixed, and there are some established, some that were pure, that did not necessarily mix, did not agree with mixing. Similar to some of what you have now, because some of them recognize that these people are divisive. They're not going to get along. They're not going to give you something. But some of the nations banded with them, thinking that they could barter with these people, and they soon learned that that was not the case. And even the controversy of the DOS rolls show that white culture, white people at that time inserted themselves. There's this term called $5 Indian that I learned, that basically they would pay $5, which probably was a lot of money then, to get on those rolls, to be able to claim the benefits of those who the treaties had been made with. And so now you had people who were European in in their lineage, but they were now designated as Native American. And so that's part of the history that you can research on your own if you want. But it's a despicable history, but it's our country. So anyway, we got that. We're coming up on our time here. I just want to reveal that to you. I'm not going to read the whole article, but if you go onto www.way.com/digest/content /Nubia.html, you will be able to read this information, and then you could take this information and go research it with what others have discovered and written about, just to get those brain juices going, as Dr. Cresswell used to say, the brain computer. But let me read this last part too, because I did kind of cut it off. So Draper's earlier quote at the time of Pi's historic conquest. Did I read that? Okay, I'm sorry. Regarding race in the ancient world, it's significant that in spite of having other names for the homeland, each major Black civilization also refers to themselves by skin. So, they named themselves by skin color. And why would they do that? Well, Black people find it necessary to designate themselves as Black in relationship to each other. Mostly likely not, however, more likely than not, the designation of Black as an identification was a response to the Aryan, white, Semite, and Europeans invasions that persisted from second millennia with the invaders' intent on conquering and plundering. Because remember, these were very wealthy societies. They were put together pretty darn well, and they were constantly building and expanding. And so, if you're kind of living out on the landscape in the bush per se, or even, in the mountainous region, and you come down here and you see that the land is plentiful, they don't have to do as much work to yield resources, then you might want to make a plan to take that over. Hence the history of what we refer to as Europeans, formerly Greeks, formerly Semites. And so invasions that persisted from the second millennium with invaders intent on conquering and plundering each of the Black societies. This is what the historian LeGrand Clegg termed ancient racism, which he defined as the persistent, systematic, and pervasive acts of aggression by white and yellow peoples against Black people from about 20,000 BC through the beginning of the Christian era that invariably resulted in the conquest, expulsion, or extermination of the Blacks and the, this is a new word for me, concomitant usurpation of their territories by non-Blacks. So that's important to note, because that puts a whole new spin on the creation of racism and who created it and why and how long it's been going on. So if this individual, Clegg, is correct in their assertions, what they're realizing is that racism has been going on for a very long time, and it's been under the guise of different reasons and rationale, but it has been there, and it has been aimed at Blacks, which would kind of explain, if we believe in the concept of genetic coding that allows us to remember certain things and behaviors. We think of genetic coding on it and phenotype, but there is genetic coding proofs that talks about behavior, especially in the animal kingdom, that certain animals know when a snake is poisonous, know when not to eat a particular plant. They just know. It's not something that's necessarily being taught. It's innate. It's built in. And so when we question, the perceived hatred that some white culture has against Black and culture, that this is something that is built in very deep, very profound, and has been going on for a very long time. So long that it has become part of the genetic coding. So that's a concept and theory that is being expressed. I'm trying to remember the coined term for that. Hopefully I'll think of it before we get off. But there's a term that speaks to that I'm just losing the wording for that based upon my observation and study. It's on the tip of my tongue. So anyway, this will be a very interesting concept to explore. on whether that feeds into why there's such hatred, because you wonder where did, even if, like, say, my grandmother told me to hate somebody, like, oh, we don't like them people because blah blah blah, there's still going to, I think, be a partial curiosity in me, like, why does she hate them, what they do, let me see for myself. I guess everybody doesn't react that way if it comes from family member and they tell you no, you just, that's it, I'm going with what grandma say, I can respect that. Not everybody is as easily convinced. So there's there would be a very interesting thought process on that. I don't know why I'm not thinking of this word. Um, so that's it. And I think all these things play a role in family, by the way, because how we learn is through initially our family and then the world around us, because our first interactions from conception until at least on average preschool age, we'll say 3, is mostly familial. And that knowledge begins to expand and awareness begins to expand as we this word is going to drive me crazy, I have to look it up, as we expand upon that. So I'm going to save this page because I'm going to do some more reading on that. I want to go to this bookmark. Okay. I'm going to find that term because I think it's important that you guys look at the term and understand the concept behind it, because it does speak to concept where behaviors encoded into DNA. Oh, I'm sorry, I found it now. Epigenetics. I just thought of it. I didn't find it on here. It just coded into my mind. So there's a concept called epigenetics, and epigenetics speaks to the encoding that one receives of behavior. And I believe this concept is still in its infancy. Let me see when it was coined. So it says it's a study of heritable. Epigenetics is a study of heritable changes in gene expression, active versus inactive genes that do not involve changes to the underlying DNA sequence, a change in phenotype without a change in genotype, which in turn affects how cells read the genes. Epigenetic change is a regular and natural occurrence, but also can be influenced by several factors, including age, the environment, lifestyle, and disease state. Epigenetic modifications can manifest as commonly as the manner in which cells terminally differentiate to end up as skin cells, liver cells, brain cells, etc. Or epigenetic change can have more damaging effects that can result in disease like cancer. At least 3 systems, including DNA, methylation, histone modification, and non-coding RNA, just ncRNA, associated gene silencing are currently considered to initiate, because there is a part of your genes that turn things on and off, and sustain epigenetic change. New and ongoing research is continuously uncovering the role of epigenetics in a variety of human disorders and fetal diseases. And so the scientists involved in that is a Conrad H. Waddington. Expanding upon that, they're looking into how the nature versus nurture concept plays a role into this, because like they said, environment plays a role. So, nature is what is given to you inherent genetically, and then nurture is what you learn that is encoded into your psyche about the world around you, and how it influences you physically, mentally, physiologically. So here's a good one. Research has shown that a mother's exposure to pollution can impact her child's asthma susceptibility, and her intake of vitamin D could change DNA methylation that influences placenta functioning. It does not stop at the mother, however, as further studies support that the father has a hand in his child's health and epigenetic marks as well. So that sperm contribution and what it has experienced encoding into his DNA based upon that father's experience and his father's experience. So they're finding that link. A child's mental fitness could be epigenetically influenced by dad's diet. So they're trying to find these correlations. It's still in its infancy. It's still early research. These are, as I say, theorems, not theories. And so, they're obviously having some effect. And what our community is doing is using this data to determine how epigenetics affects the experience in slavery. So, for example, we have encoded in us, that slavery memory cell of our ancestors, or I should say memory sequencing, because we're talking about a DNA level underlying, but not affecting. So it's not changing the coding. DNA is a sequence, it's coding. It's like computer coding. It's telling you go there and you make this and you do that and you are this and that's a leg and that's an arm, etc. Okay. Um, and so now they're trying to break down because there's so many things physiologically that we don't understand about the DNA coding. We've developed, the ability to replicate DNA. Through sequencing and through the process of, why am I forgetting the term? It's basically a way where you centrifuge, spin it, and it grows. It starts to replicate, and then you put it into a synthesizer that allows you to read it. So anyway, I have to think about that later. It's too many things to remember. But anyway, so that's that set of information, probably new to those who come on listening to me like, oh, I never heard that before. She's crazy. Okay, that's fine. I'll be crazy. But look it up for yourself, because you don't have to believe me. Why should you believe me? I'm no expert. And even though I was an expert, why should you believe me? So anyway, look it up for yourself. Research it. I'm so happy to be back. Glad to be on here. I see that the viewership has gone up. Although I think my membership has gone down a little bit, but I'm at 33 members, I guess. Felt I was at a little bit higher than that, but that's okay. As I come on, more, people be interested. People are like, oh, she fell off. She ain't coming back. Well, hey, life happens. Summer months, July is my kids' month, both of them. And so I get so busy. And so anyway, no more excuses. So I hope you all enjoyed the show today. I hope you learned some information. I hope some of the concepts that I presented, you're able to expand upon. You can agree, disagree. My viewership is not coming on with me yet, but that's okay, because Dr. Amos Wilson and all these other people had their starts. And that's what gives me hope that, because I enjoy dialoguing with people. I enjoy talking about these kind of things. I enjoy sharing information. And I enjoy debating information to a certain, degree. I would like for our debates to be more sensical. I just had a guy block me on Facebook, because I was critical of his style of debating. You're, calling people names. You're telling them they're stupid. They're not educated, blah, blah, blah. How would you know this? These are complete strangers to you. How do you know what people's background is unless they share it with you? And so you're just debating information. Stick to the information. Not concerned about what you know and don't know. I'm concerned about what you're talking about. And if we can go out and look at that information and expand upon it, incorporate it, or we have to trash it. That's how I look at things. But apparently he was not fit for the test because he could not handle my style. And so he blocked me. And I wasn't disrespectful to him. In a party shot, I did tell him, that, I would appreciate it if he stuck to the information and not behave like an adult child. And please do, refrain from, name calling and all this other crap. I'm talking about his behaviors, and, maybe I take him seriously, so I guess that was the straw that broke the camel's back for him. So he blocked me. Oh, well, in my opinion and my thought process is, if I make you block me, then there was nothing else you can do to add to the argument. And that's just my opinion. I haven't blocked anyone today. I just don't disagree. I don't agree with you. Just don't agree with you. I think that you're wrong, and that's the end of it. So we're just going to have to say you're wrong and I'm wrong, because that's the way we think. But I don't have to block you for what? As long as you're not stalking me or acting crazy, but just because you have a different point of view on blocking. But to me, that's the difference between a European mind and an African mind. We are more empathetic. There's a study out that I learned about that actually proved that people of African origins are more empathetic just by nature. We're more empathetic, and it's just the way it is. And we can relate better. We're more accepting. So look that up. But anyway, I hope y'all enjoy your day. I hope you have a good Sunday. I hope it's productive. And I hope everything go as planned for you. So I will talk to you on the next stream. See you next Sunday, if all goes well. Bye.